You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 8th of October 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Coming up on today's programme, President Trump and Prime Minister Carney meet in DC.
He is a very strong, very good leader. He's a nice man, but he can be nasty. He can be very nasty. Maybe as nasty as anybody.
Ed Stocker and Chris Cermak, not a nasty bone between them, will join me to consider what we've learned about the direction of travel, not just for the US-Canada relationship, but for the broader global balance between moderates and right-wingers. Also ahead, we'll mull the impact on business of the ongoing US shutdown. We'll consider the cost of comedy in Saudi Arabia, and our Sophie Monaghan-Coombs is here with a culture wrap. What have you got for us, Sophie?
Well, Tom, Freeze London is taking place next week, so I thought we'd focus on this city we are in today. We'll talk about what we can expect from the fair, some interesting developments in London's restaurant scene, and a great exhibition that has just opened.
Sophie, looking forward to that. Always like to hear about what's happening right on my doorstep too. That is a jam-packed show in prospect for you today, here on The Briefing with me, Tom Edwards. A very warm welcome to this Wednesday edition of the programme. Now, it has been a busy week, it's safe to say, for many of the world's top leaders. Questions are swirling around about who has the upper hand between moderates and right-wingers, well, on both sides of the Atlantic and across the European bloc. We're going to interrogate this in a bit more detail. Joining me is Monocle's Europe editor-at-large, Ed Stocker. Good afternoon, Ed.
Good afternoon, Tom.
And alongside me here in Studio One at Midori House, Monocle senior news editor Chris Cermak. Good afternoon to you, Chris.
Good afternoon, Tom. Good to be here.
Chris, let me start with you. A meeting of Trump and Carney. We had a little clip there just at the top of the show. Trump, I don't know, he still manages to kind of surprise me on the up and downside with his pronouncements. What did you make of the meeting and what they have both had to say about it?
It is always surprising, isn't it? Just the dynamics when Trump meets with leaders. Sometimes he's quite conciliatory. Other times he himself can be quite nasty. And so I think it is very interesting in this moment to look at these two leaders who have really been quite negative about each other in the past. Yesterday they came together in this very, frankly, lovey-dovey kind of press conference chat before they met. And that seems to be the mood that Donald Trump is in, at least at the moment, when it comes to some of these more moderate leaders. He praised Mark Carney as a strong leader, etc., etc. He did the same earlier this week with President Lula of Brazil, which I found interesting too. But when you put both of those together, you take these two centrist leaders, they also want something from Donald Trump. And that's what also I think is so fascinating about this. Trump seems to be in a conciliatory mood, saying he wants to reach deals. And yet there is no deal outstanding, right? Both Canada and Brazil, if you look at those two as an example, are waiting for some sort of trade deal to end punishing tariffs on both of their countries. So at the moment, you're seeing a lot of nice rhetoric all of a sudden, but whether there will be any action to follow that is the big question.
Well, and this is really interesting, Ed. Do you think there's a challenge for leadership in countries like Italy and France that is in some way influenced by what we're seeing in the US, where there's a polarised politics, but there's also a personality question that supersedes that?
I mean, there's definitely, if you look at France and Italy, there is polarisation. Arguably, it sort of all started in the US. So they definitely have that challenge on their hand, don't you? In Italy, it's kind of interesting because, we've talked about this far-right government, and it really, one person's far-right is another centre-right, which is a strange thing to say, but there are lots of different optics and ways of looking at it. The thing that Meloni's done, which arguably Trump hasn't, is she was very outspoken but before she became Prime Minister, and she has changed her tone to a large extent. I mean, I guess you could say Trump has, he's just so unpredictable, isn't it? One minute he might be maybe having a relatively calm meeting with Canada, and the next he's blowing off on social media. But what Meloni's done is sort of, I guess she's adapted to office, and she's realised that she needs to court the European Union. She needs to take a specific line on Ukraine. At the same time, there is friction within society. So, that's not, the fact that she presides over a surprisingly stable government, unlike France, and we'll probably come to that in a second. There are tensions. Not everyone loves her by any stretch of the imagination. And, I was on Monocle Radio just recently talking about, obviously, the national strike that took place in the country. There is a lot of anger bubbling under the surface. People have been calling her complicit in the so-called genocide in Gaza. The fact that, Leonardo continues to sell arms to Israel. The fact that she hasn't taken a stronger line on what has been happening with Israel. And even though she said she would recognise Palestine based on a number of caveats and conditions. So society is split, but what she has managed to do, incredibly successful for Italy, given its track record, is hold a government together. Given that history shows Italy is having a lot of short-term government since the Second World War. Now that's been flipped with the fact that in just over a year, France is the one that's becoming more like that. 4 different prime ministers in the space of just over a year, and obviously Le Cornu competing with Liz Truss for surviving a cabbage.
I believe it was
not.
I believe it was a lettuce.
A lettuce, sorry.
Get your vegetables right.
I got my vegetables mixed up.
Just quickly, so let's look across the border. What's the take from where you are? Because it is interesting that, Macron is obviously in real trouble. And as you said, there's financial or economic underpinnings to the problems that Meloni is trying to address where you are. Clearly the issue in France. I don't know, what's the take? Is Macron in trouble? Is it existential? Do you think there is a way out of the crisis? I don't understand how you can address these fundamental, foundational economic problems if you cannot even put a government together that lasts 30 days, right?
Yeah, I know. And I love this line from Roger Cohen in the New York Times. He said, "The stable Italy of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is gloating." Referring to what's happening in France. Well, I mean, perhaps. It's certainly true that in comparison to France right now, Italy does look stable, although there are a whole load of serious problems in Italy that we don't have time to get into probably on this show. But yeah, Macron has a serious problem. I think, look, it's unlikely, and I'm sure we've said this on Monocle Radio before, it's unlikely he's going to step down before the end of his term in 2027, because that would throw up a whole lot of fundamental problems to do with the very nature of how France works. It would set a precedent for sort of being able to topple or certainly weaken a president, and that, their president, he's head of state, and so I think that would be very difficult. But one wonders how long it is until he is forced to dissolve Parliament and we head for new elections. And if that happens, it does seem highly likely that the far right Rassemblement National, which is waiting in the wings, would get into power. He seems to be burying his head in the ground. The fact that Le Cornu was even named as prime minister was kind of more of the same. He was an insider, a Macron loyalist, centre right, not paying attention to any of the things the either far left and far right that have important positions in the National Assembly are calling for. And so even, Le Cornu, naming Bruno Le Maire, who is very unpopular and is a kind of continuous from the past, if you like. Again, this burying of the head in the sand. And so it seems that that's what Macron wants to do. And so unless he changes tack, I don't see this impasse ending. And
no, it's going to be
there being an election.
Yeah, it's going to be very complicated. Chris, let me bring you back in here, because this is interesting. This is this other core narrative, which is the seeming inability of centrists, I guess, right, to deliver economic reform or economic boosts. And we're seeing this clearly in France, as Ed's been describing. It's also happening in Germany with this sort of vaunted autumn of reform that actually isn't changing very much. Why is this such a problem wherever you look?
I think it's interesting that particularly in Europe at the moment, sort of three of the biggest economies really are facing the same thing, with sort of the centrists or centre-right, centre-left holding on to power, desperately grasping for power, with the right wing sort of snapping at their heels. In France, as Ed mentioned, it should be said there's some breaking news just recently that Sébastien Lecornu now says that he thinks a budget deal can actually be reached this year, and that snap parliamentary elections are less likely. But who knows whether that's actually going to come to pass or not. And in Germany today, yes, as well, there's this sort of grand coalition, a last gasp effort of the centre-right and the centre-left, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. They're meeting today to try and rescue what Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor, called a fall and autumn of reforms that he wants to enact. Germany's economy has been in recession for 2 years now. They are desperate to find some ways. You mentioned the auto sector, to revive the auto sector, which is struggling with electric cars. But one of the very controversial ways that Merz wants to go about this is to loosen the restrictions that would end petrol cars and look at when that should end. But that the Social Democrats claim that sends mixed messages to the car industry. So there's a lot of issues there that they haven't been able to sort out. And I think this is a central problem that you have. The centrists can't really agree on a decisive way forward to get their economies back on track. They're meant to be the ones that are, the experts, the capable ones to rescue their economies. But that simply hasn't been what we're seeing. The same thing here in the UK, for that matter. All of these economies are struggling, and that's what's offering the centre-right a window, an opportunity to win at the next elections. France, Germany, UK, you name it. So it'll be interesting to see whether the centrist ground can rescue anything in the next couple of years.
Well, just to that point, we're not seeing a pivot from the populists in terms of their narrative, their approach to tackling these issues. And whether we look at someone like Javier Milei, even in Argentina, he's still doing the Rockstar Act. Trump's also doing the same thing. He's doing a book tour. The economic travails don't seem to knock them off their course, and they're not even attempting the niceties of pivoting their narratives, Chris, are they? And
it is,
I guess,
a fair
for
point.
the centrists, that makes it ever more difficult, because they'll feel politically nothing that they say or do works.
I think that's absolutely true. I think this is it goes back to what you said at the beginning, personality versus competence as well. So I think what you see from some of these right-wing leaders is confidence, bravado, right? They're leaning into what they stand for, regardless of what the impact is on the economy. But for voters, that does at least give the impression that somebody is in charge, that somebody is taking action, whether it's actually helping the economy or not. There is a risk that the US could also go back into recession. We'll hear about that maybe in just a moment, a bit more about the US. But yes, there is a bravado there from Trump. There's a bravado from Milei, holding a rock concert, putting out a book about his miracle economy, despite the fact that you're also seeing a weakening of the Argentine currency there and a major economic crisis that will require some help from the US. That's the other thing perhaps to add. The right wing is really sticking together. So even Trump wants to help Milei. You haven't really seen that among the centrists, have you? They're not sticking together and helping each other out.
It's absolutely fascinating. Thanks both for sharing your insights. From Milan, from right here in London, Monocle's Europe editor-at-large Ed Stocker and Monocle's senior news editor Chris Cermak here in London. Plenty going on around the world. Let's find out what is happening. Our Laura Kramer is standing by with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Tom. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were to join Gaza peace talks that continued in Egypt today between Israel and Hamas. U.S. President Donald Trump yesterday sounded an optimistic note that there was a possibility of peace in the Middle East in the coming days. The Nobel Prize for Chemistry has gone to 3 scientists for the development of metal organic frameworks with applications in everything from gas storage to drug deliveries. The scientists are from Kyoto University, the University of Melbourne, and the University of California, Berkeley. And all the remaining hikers who were stranded on Mount Everest have now been rescued. Nearly 600 hikers and 300 Sherpas had been caught on the world's tallest mountain after an unexpected blizzard hit over the weekend. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. We'll have the latest news updated at the top of the next hour and on the hour throughout the day here on Monocle Radio. Right, let's switch sites across the Atlantic once again. The US shutdown, which Chris was just alluding to, continues, but for how long? And at what cost to business? Well, joining us now, I'm delighted to say, is Jordan Holman, New York Times business reporter and author of the highly recommended Corner Office column. Jordan, good morning to you, bright and early. Thanks for joining us on the programme.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Tell me, what's your take on this? How are companies dealing with this? Because I think one of the complicated things from my vantage point is that one never quite knows how long these shutdowns are going to last. And that presumably provides quite the challenge if you're helming a business.
Absolutely. It all comes down to the duration of how long the shutdown lasts. And so the CEOs that I'm talking to, they're really taking the same approach that they have been to everything happening with the Trump administration, trying to just keep their heads down, not overcorrect or think that, this is going to last forever, but to just kind of focus on what they can control is the common phrase you'll hear. I think for the companies that are more exposed to government contracts or doing a lot of business in and around DC, they're having to think more proactively about what a prolonged shutdown could mean for not only their customers, but their employees, and then looking at their bottom lines.
Well, yeah, and just briefly on this, Jordan, I guess whenever these more challenging scenarios are kind of broiling around, it's often tempting to look at it and say, oh, is there a silver lining to this? Is there a positive thread? We're a very positive bunch at Monocle. And often we say, when times are challenging, it rewards businesses that are fleet of foot or that are more adaptable in their approach. Are there any crumbs of comfort here? Or is broadly, this is just something that it would be better for everyone if they got it sorted as soon as possible?
I think it's definitely the latter, but if you are going to take a positive spin on it, I think a CEO could see this as a time to build the muscle of being extremely flexible. Thinking back to in April when everyone's trying to figure out tariffs and creating war rooms and thinking of all the scenarios, so that you're not going to enact all the scenarios, but at least you have a playbook for it. I think some are looking at the shutdown as another example of having to be flexible, having to go to Plan B.
Yeah, exactly. Always good if you've got that dexterity, Jordan, right? Let me ask you about another trend. This is super interesting, I think, which I'm sure our listeners and readers around the world will have been, if they're eagle-eyed, will have spotted. And this is trend of kind of co-CEOs. Now, I imagine the demography you're talking to right there, some of them probably really into it, some less so. Why is this happening? And why are people, I think, right to interrogate this at the moment?
Right. So here in the U.S., it's still a very rare phenomena for companies to have two CEOs. Like, it's less than 2% of big companies over here that have that model. But one reason we might see it more, Oracle, Spotify, Comcast are the big examples right now. But one of the reasons boards might consider it more is an acknowledgement that a job of a CEO is too much to handle for one person. To have someone who can understand tariffs, who can understand labor issues, who can understand AI, that might be asking for too much. And that if you split the job responsibilities, you can get two people with different subject matter experts in there. And then also you look at some companies, they're positioning their CEOs, one's on the East Coast of the US and the other's on the West Coast, to try to be able to handle global communications a bit easier.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just really, really quickly, do you think that some of the boards, the people who are making these decisions, are they influenced at all by the apparent success of sharing these roles? I don't know, maybe in the European market? We also always look at things very much from skewed in one direction early in terms of how corporate culture is shaped here in Europe. But do you think, I don't know, they might look at some smaller players and say, look, these businesses are actually demonstrating that many hands actually make light work and it's more effective?
Yeah, it's absolutely more common where you all are. I think one of the tricky things is that, the culture over there is more egalitarian, more consensus driven. That is not exactly how I would describe corporate America. But I will say that boards are kind of okay with this uneven power balance. They actually think that works better with co-CEOs, so that maybe things don't have to be equal, but they complement each other well. And I think that's the biggest thing, that if you're going to name two CEOs, do they complement each other well, and can they play nice?
Yeah, the latter question, I'm sure, often goes unanswered. Jordan, great to check in with you. Thanks for being with us bright and early on your side of the pond. That was Jordan Holman, New York Times business reporter and author of the Corner Office column. You're with The Briefing here on Monocle Radio, and let's continue now. The Riyadh Comedy Festival wraps up tomorrow. It's safe to say the event has divided opinion somewhat. Plenty of global comedy royalty, Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr, Kevin Hart and others, have faced, I would say, some degree of opprobrium for taking some large fees to perform in Saudi. So what will the event's legacy be? Well, delighted to say we're joined now by Monocle's golf correspondent, Inzmam Rashid. Good afternoon to you, Inzi. Great to have you on the show again. What do you make of this one? I think it's a super interesting story. Where you are, how are people sort of talking about this big event that's been taking place?
Afternoon, Tom. Yeah, Riyadh Comedy Season Festival. It's the inaugural one. It finishes tomorrow. And as you mentioned, more than 50 headliners from the US and UK accepted invites. Dave Chappelle, as you mentioned, Kevin Hart, Jimmy Carr, Jack Whitehall as well. And critics jumped fast on this. It's being framed as comedy washing, using art as soft propaganda to kind of gloss over continued rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. It's been called out by many human rights groups as well, and from other comedians who've explicitly called out the comedians who have taken part. David Cross, the American actor and comedian, blasted it as blood money, saying that he's disgusted how anyone can take the comedians who've taken part seriously again. And some participants have kind of pushed back in their own way. Jessica Kirsten, she's openly gay. She said that she later regretted doing the show, but insisted that she'd negotiated permissions to bring gay material on stage, and has since donated her fees to human rights causes. Dave Chappelle stirred controversy, as you'd probably expect, by quipping that it's easier to talk here in Riyadh than it is in America. But I think what the important point is that actually some of the money that has been offered, up to $1.6 million for some of the artists, which is eye-watering, especially for a kind of comedian standard as well. But I think, look, where it gets interesting is Saudi Arabia, Tom, can't just be dismissed as this kind of villain twirling its mustache. The truth is that Saudi can't be ignored. This is a country in the middle of an unprecedented cultural and economic transformation. The World Cup is coming in 2034, the Football World Cup. The F1 there is now a fixture. Riyadh season has pulled in boxing's biggest bouts, and international artists from Post Malone to Andrea Bocelli are performing in front of Saudi audiences that 10 years ago wouldn't have even been allowed to dance in public. So yes, there's hypocrisy, but there's also momentum, and momentum matters, and that's what is being noticed, particularly here in other Gulf states like Dubai, where it's had these kind of performances and has invited these kind of people for many years now.
Inzi, super interesting. Just really quickly, I want to ask you a second question, because I think it was Louis C.K. who said, look, they did say I couldn't do any jokes about the royal family or, the state of governance in Saudi. And Louis C.K. said, I haven't got any material on that, so it was fine, which I thought was fairly a sort of a mordant comment. But lots of the comedians they didn't talk about that, but they went in hard on some pretty controversial issues around, gender equality, the sort of mores of sex and all the rest of it. Do you have any sense of how this material landed with the audience? That's what I find super, super interesting, because the material is pretty challenging. I saw Dave Chappelle in London 2 weeks ago. He doesn't hold back. Bill Burr doesn't hold back. There are a lot of outspoken comics. How's there, more risque material? Do we know how that landed with the audience?
Look, I think Saudi Arabia has just been a lot more accepting of this. Look, it's not like they live under this massive rock. They've got access to the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime and all that kind of stuff, where they can watch a lot of these comedians actually perform. A lot of these aren't censored in places like Saudi, so they can see it. And, Saudis don't just stay in Saudi all year round. They travel across to the likes of London, to over to the US, to New York and places like that. And they will go and see some of these comedians as well. And then you've got to remember as well, Tom, there are a load of expats in Saudi Arabia as well. So this wouldn't have just been, Saudis or kind of locals rocking up to this festival. This would have been people from all around the world. So I do think it's been taken well. I think the noise from other kind of press around the world has probably been a bigger distraction than actually what's taken place in Riyadh. It's a paradox, I think, worth watching for the future. There's a kingdom that definitely wants laughter, but mainly only up until a specific point. But also Saudi can't be ignored, as I mentioned. It's open for the world to come and see, and that's what they want to happen.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, Izzy. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. That's Monocle's Gulf correspondent Inzamam Rashid joining us here on The Briefing. And we're going to continue training our lens on matters cultural as we wrap up today's programme. Delighted to say joining me in the studio is Monocle's Associate Editor for Culture, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs. Good afternoon, Sophie. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And you tempted us at the top of the show with some interesting news lines out of London. Of course, all eyes on the capital for next week. Freeze rolls into town. Always an exciting time of year. But there's plenty going on, isn't there?
Yes, there's lots to talk about. I thought maybe I'd start with the story that I reported for the October issue of Monocle, which is available now. And I profiled Jeremy King, who is restaurant royalty, as we said in the piece. And I had a tour of his newest restaurant that he is currently transforming on the Strand. And it was really interesting. I'm sure you know lots about him, and I'm sure you've eaten at some of his establishments. And it was really interesting to meet him and chat to him about the current state of dining in the city.
Well, yeah, and just on that, upbeat, optimistic. I think I'm sure our listeners have probably heard from Jeremy before on our airwaves. They certainly read his words in print. He isn't broadly optimistic. What was his sense of the sort of taking the temperature of the market?
Yeah, so he's had a very interesting career because, you know, he was behind restaurants like Le Caprice, the Wolseley, the Ivy, kind of started all these restaurants and you know, had lots of attention, lots of very famous people. Lucien Foy dined every night in one of them. And then he sort of lost it all and now he's rebuilding it. And I think he was broadly optimistic. You know, he did say things that really impact the dining scene, such as not having somewhere to park when you go to the theatre. But he's very pro, you know, the kind of romance and the ritual of eating in restaurants. And he really says, you know, if you come out of the theatre, you should be able to get somewhere for a drink, yes, but you should also be able to get a little bite to eat. So he's introduced discounts for late night diners in some of his current spots. In Simpsons in the Strand, this new place that he is renovating, they will have a speakeasy style bar which will have a 3 a.m. licence, and that is, you know, it's right by Charing Cross, it's right in the centre of town. So I think broadly very optimistic. And you know, for him, he says restaurants, there's nowhere like restaurants. Cultural things come out of restaurants. They don't come out of Zoom meetings or WhatsApp messages. And I think that was really positive. Yeah, I'll drink to that, possibly at 3 a.m. by Charing Cross, if the fancy takes me. Let's look at Tate. There's a brilliant, I was looking at this actually earlier, this Nigerian modernism exhibition, which looks incredible. Tell me a bit about this one. Yes, this is a really excellent exhibition that opens today, and so I would really recommend people go to see it if you're in town for Freeze, but it's also open until May next year, so there's lots of time. And they've brought together over 50 artists across this 50-year period of Nigerian history, the 1940s until the 1990s. Of course, there were obvious very big changes in that country during that time. So we had British colonialism, of course, independence in 1960, but then the outbreak of civil war 7 years later. And so this exhibition encompasses all of those cultural and political crises and events and real, you know, tragedies with Biafra. And it brings together all of those different influences as well. You've got kind of Western-influenced art schools with a kind of indigenous, you know, flavour as well, but then people kind of fighting against that Western influence, and all of that coming together creates for some really interesting work. So I will just throw to a little clip we have from Bilal Akouche, who's the Assistant Curator for International Art at Tate Modern, and he'll give a little introduction into what it is like.
We're looking at over 50 years of artistic production, artistic and cultural production, in fact, and there's around 59 artists. Each room sort of is dedicated to either a different artist or a different movement. And we really wanted to showcase the breadth and diversity and breadth of medium. For example, we have textile, sculpture, ceramics, painting, beadwork in the show. And we just wanted our audiences to understand that there was such a diverse and compelling output of artistic and cultural production in Nigeria during this period. And we're really excited for our audiences to see. In terms of themes, what's really interesting is there's artists that are grappling with big themes around sort of nationhood, Nigeria becoming an independent country, but also the same artists looking at daily life and daily ritual, thinking about their own familial histories, their own personal histories, alongside big ideas of nationhood, of belonging, of community. The exhibition does a lot and says a lot, and we're really excited for our audiences to kind of find out more.
Yeah, that's Bilal Akoush, who's a curator for international at Tate Modern, and that show comes highly recommended. Sophie, look, you began by talking about Frieze next week. It's always a really kind of exciting time in London. There is that sense of almost palpable sort of anticipation. To that end, what are you most looking forward to?
Well, yes, we are, of course, round the corner from Regent's Park, where Frieze London is taking place, alongside Frieze Sculpture, which is already open, and, of course, Frieze Masters, which shows works made before the year 2000. So things that I'm looking forward to in particular, you were talking earlier to Inzi about the comedy festival, and Frieze gives an artist award every year, and this year it's been given to an American Qatari artist, Sophia Al-Maria, and she's decided to build a mock comedy club within the fair. And so this, I think, will just be very interesting. It'll definitely be a little unusual, but I think it should be an experience. She'll be kind of hosting these comedy shows, and it will definitely be poking fun at the art market in general. And I'm sure that Frieze haven't put any restrictions on what she has to say. Other things that I think are kind of interesting at the moment, there's been a lot of talk of the doom and gloom of the art market. Particularly this week with some figures that have come out of Hauser and Worth and David Zwana. But there are also lots of new galleries and spaces opening, and they're all sort of timed with Frieze. So Sadie Coles, Rose Easton are a couple, but one of the ones that I wanted to point out, which I had a little sneak preview of earlier this week, is YDP, which is on Bedford Square, and it focuses on bringing East Asian artists and curators into London and kind of creating connections between the two places. So their new place is really lovely. It's this gorgeous renovated old Georgian townhouse, and it's got this very big exhibition running all the way through it. And then it also has a converted muse house, which will be used for artist residencies. So I would recommend visiting that as well if you're in town.
Sophie, I'm sure we will hear more from you as Frieze approaches and during the fair itself. But thanks for giving us a far-reaching roundup of cultural happenings across London town. Sophie Monaghan, who's Monocle's Associate Editor for Culture, thank you very much. And that is all we have time for on a very busy edition of The Briefing here in London. It was produced by Chris Cermak, our researcher was Joanna Moser, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. My thanks to them, one and all. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Chris himself in the chair, noon London time. But from me, Tom Edwards, and the Wednesday team, goodbye and thanks for listening.